Something was breathing behind the gate, and whatever it was, it had been waiting. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and like to support Inspector Vale. It keeps these cases coming. The afternoon train hissed into Coldwater Junction, its brakes whining like something uneasy about stopping here. Miss Margaret Hale stepped onto the platform, spine straight, eyes sharp, every instinct tuned for trouble. She'd crossed state lines for less, but the letter from Lillian Ashford had carried a strain she couldn't ignore. Come soon. Things aren't settling right. Lillian never used ellipses. That alone had been enough. A black sedan idled near the station, Briggs, Briarcrest's long-serving driver, waiting with hat in hand. Miss Hale, Mrs. Ashford sends her regrets about the knees. They've ignored her orders for decades, Margaret said, letting him take her case. Coldwater drifted past the windows in a slow parade of earnest simplicity. Diner, pharmacy, a tiny herbal shop with dried bundles in its window. Quaint, peaceful, pretending. Then came the oak-lined drive and Briarcrest Manor rising ahead like an old verdict. Pale stone, high windows and gardens so meticulously shaped they looked afraid of disappointing someone. Lillian Ashford waited at the entrance. Tall, silver-haired, and gripping her cane just a shade too tightly. "You came," Lillian said, pulling Margaret into a brief, fierce embrace. "Good, I needed company." "Company," Margaret echoed. "Or witnesses," Lillian didn't answer. Inside, tea waited in a sunlit room. Margaret noticed everything. An extra lock added recently, a rug shifted to hide a damaged floorboard, a faint scent of lavender where it didn't belong. Signs of a house trying to look undisturbed. "Nora's here," Lillian said. "My niece, she's been restless, wandering, sketching plants at odd hours, says she's fine." "And you doubt it?" "I doubt everything lately." Later they walked the gardens, roses crisp in their beds, the clipped hedges exact and obedient. It was all so controlled, it made the single flaw stand out sharper. Halfway along a narrow yew corridor, Lillian stopped so abruptly Margaret nearly collided with her. "Maggie, look." At the end of the path, set into a tall stone wall, stood an iron gate, ornate, heavy, impossible to budge without intention. And it was open, not ajar, not weather-warped. Open. A chill threaded up Margaret's spine. "You keep this locked." "For 25 years, Lillian whispered. "Since the fall, since the accident in the old garden." Margaret stepped closer. Fresh scrape on the hinge. Soil shifted underfoot. Prints overlapping on the gravel, carefully placed, doubled back. Someone had gone inside. Someone who didn't want their direction known. Margaret touched the cold iron and felt it. Not magic, not superstition. Just the unmistakable pulse of a human secret, and the certainty it wasn't finished. Margaret woke before dawn with that precise unease that meant a puzzle had turned into a problem. The corridor outside her room was dark. No line of light from Nora's door. Downstairs, the breakfast tray was laid but untouched. Lillian appeared in the doorway, shaken. "Maggie, Nora's gone." "How?" "Her bed's turned back but not slept in. Yesterday's dress is missing, her nightgown's still there, and her shoes, they're not in the room." "Then we start with the garden," Margaret said. They took the narrow path between the yews, Briggs following without being told. The air smelled strongly of lavender, as if someone had pushed through the plants in the night. The iron gate came into view. So did the shoes. They sat neatly side by side in front of the threshold, the flats Nora had worn at dinner. Toes pointed toward the old garden. Not dropped, placed. Lillian's cane tapped the stone once. "She wouldn't go in there at night," she whispered. "Not into that place." Margaret crouched. Damp, dark soil clung to the soles, garden earth, not gravel. Nora had walked on soft ground, then stepped out of her shoes here. On the wall, a wild rose pushed between the stones. A tiny thread of pale gray wool clung to a thorn, Nora's shawl. "Briggs," Margaret asked quietly, "was this gate locked last night?" "Yes, ma'am, I turned the key myself." Yet the bars now stood firm and the key, in theory, was in the study. Someone had opened the gate, gone in with Nora, then locked it again. "Call the constable," Margaret said. Constable Merritt arrived quickly. He heard them out, then went to the late Mr. Ashford's desk. When he returned, he held the heavy key. "Found it where you said," he told Lillian. It turned the lock smoothly. The gate swung inward with a low groan. Inside, the abandoned garden was a tangle of lavender, foxgloves, and climbing roses. Beneath the wildness, Margaret could still see the bones of a careful design. "Nora," Merritt called. "Miss Ashford." No reply. Margaret watched the ground. The soil held a band of small prints leading inward from the gate, Nora's by size. Crossing them was a second line, deeper and broader. Boots. They followed both trails to an old stone bird bath. The basin held rainwater and petals. Beside it, the earth bore two deep knee marks where someone heavier had knelt. "She came this far," Merritt said. "Then what?" Ahead, the tracks broke into smudges and snapped stems. But to the right, among foxgloves, Margaret saw something wrong. Most spires were the usual purple. A few were not slimmer, with pale gold bells and different leaves. Not a common border plant. Exactly the kind of rarity Nora had been sketching. Exactly the kind of thing someone else might want to take. Merritt followed her gaze. "You think those matter?" "I think Nora came here on purpose," Margaret said. She looked again at the overlapping prints. Small feet, heavy boots, side by side for a while, then only the boots continuing. "The flowers explain why she walked through that gate." "And the boots?" Merritt asked. "They explain why she didn't walk back out," Margaret said. The morning after Alina's disappearance hit Briarcrest like a cold draft seeping through old stone. Lillian paced the drawing room, twisting her cane with a tension she rarely showed. Briggs had already searched the grounds twice, and the constable was due to return, but nothing dulled the weight of the unspoken. Alina had gone into the garden and she had not come back out. Margaret stepped outside again, refusing to waste daylight. The overgrown garden felt different now, heavier, as if the vines themselves were listening. Dew clung to every branch. The air smelled of lavender crushed under hurried steps. She followed the narrow trail toward the rusted gate. Two pale shoe prints remained where Alina had left them the night before. The shoes themselves were gone now, bagged by the constable, but the earth still remembered. Margaret crouched, studying the soil carefully. The prints overlapped in an odd way, as though Alina had been standing still while someone else moved around her. She rose and walked deeper into the garden's tangle. The old stone paths curved like forgotten sentences, half erased by time. Something tugged her attention toward the center, toward a shape she hadn't noticed in the confusion of last night. The bird bath. Yesterday it had been just another relic. Today something glinted within it. She stepped closer. Rainwater filled the basin, but beneath the surface, a thin metallic circle caught the faint sunlight. She reached in and pulled out a silver token, heavier than it looked. One side bore the emblem of a botanical society. The other side was engraved with a crest she didn't recognize. Why would that be here? Before she could form an answer, Briggs called from behind her. "Ma'am, there's more." He pointed toward a cluster of foxgloves, tall purple spikes swaying with the breeze, but among them stood a different bloom, pale gold, fragile, almost glowing despite the gray morning. Margaret moved toward it slowly. "That can't be wild growth." "No, ma'am," Briggs said quietly, "and someone's been digging here. Recently." The soil around the golden plant had been disturbed with deliberate care, not torn up by an animal or storm, handled, examined, coveted. A second set of footprints circled the area, deeper, heavier. So Alina hadn't just wandered into the garden. She had come here to meet someone. Margaret followed the trail toward the shed leaning crookedly against the far wall. The door resisted at first before scraping open. The air inside smelled of damp wood and something sharper, fertilizer maybe. On the table sat a shallow mound of fresh potting soil. Next to it lay fragments of a root system recently cut. She leaned closer. Someone had been preparing to transplant the golden foxglove, not for study, not for preservation, for removal. Briggs stepped beside her. "Ma'am, someone's been using this place at night." Margaret didn't argue. She could feel it too, the sense of recent presence, of breath still lingering in the dark corners. But as they stepped outside, another detail snapped into focus. A narrow trail of broken stems and scuffed earth led away from the shed, toward the far wall where ivy grew thick in heavy curtains. Someone had searched there too, pulling vines back, testing stones, searching for something hidden, or hiding something themselves. Margaret brushed aside the ivy. Nothing but old mortar and solid stone, but her instincts hummed with warning. Someone had been desperate, and desperation rarely came alone. She stepped back, scanning the path again. The trail curved, not randomly, but with intention. It circled the foxgloves, skirted the lavender, and ended abruptly near the center of the garden. Right at the stone well. The metal grate lay slightly off-center, not where the wind would push it. Margaret's breath stalled. "Briggs, bring the constable. Now." The garden wasn't hiding secrets anymore. It was holding them. The constable arrived within minutes, breath fogging in the cool air as Briggs led him straight to the well. Margaret stood beside it, arms folded tightly, watching the man study the grate as if it were a crime scene. And perhaps it was. "This wasn't shifted by weather," the constable said quietly. "Someone moved it, someone recently." "Eleanor met someone here," Margaret answered, "and something frightened her enough that she ran or was chased." She paused, letting her eyes trace the line of broken foliage leading back toward the foxgloves. Whatever happened began there. The constable removed the grate, knelt, and lowered a lantern. The yellow glow dissolved into darkness a few feet down, illuminating stone walls slick with moss. No movement, no voice calling back. But the smell rising from the depth was disturbing, stale air trapped too long. Briggs cleared his throat. "What now?" "We search again," the constable said. Top to bottom, she didn't just disappear. Their second sweep of the garden was harsher, more deliberate. Branches snapped. Vines tore. The garden no longer felt like a sacred relic. It felt like a grid to be solved. And the deeper they pushed, the more Margaret sensed the pattern behind the chaos. Someone had moved through these paths with purpose. Someone who knew exactly what they wanted. Briggs called out from the herb beds. Margaret hurried to him, pushing aside overgrown lavender. He was pointing at the soil. "Here." Someone dug, then covered it back up. They knelt. The earth looked soft, uneven, the top layer brushed smooth with nothing but fingertips. The constable dug with a small spade, turning the soil in tense silence. After a few inches, the blade struck something flat. A wrapped bundle. Margaret steadied herself. The constable lifted it carefully, peeling back oilcloth. Inside, a set of precision plant tools, labeled specimens, and a folded sheet covered in neat botanical notes. Not Eleanor's handwriting, a stranger's. Someone had cataloged the rare plants in Briarcrest's garden with cold precision, listing values beside each Latin name as though pricing antiques. "This wasn't curiosity," Margaret said. "This was a harvest list." The constable nodded grimly. Whoever buried this planned to return. They didn't expect anyone to look here. Margaret scanned the notes, sketched outlines of the garden, arrows pointing to the foxgloves, and circled markings around the old shed. But something near the bottom froze her breath. A name. Not a signature, but a reference. C. Harrow, collector contact. The name meant nothing to Margaret, but the careful, methodical handwriting chilled her more than the well's dark mouth. Briggs tugged her sleeve. "Ma'am, look." He pointed toward the far corner of the garden, where the stone wall met a hedge of wild roses. A narrow path cut through, barely visible unless you knew to search for it. And someone had cleared it recently. Margaret exchanged a look with the constable. The garden wasn't just a hiding place. It had been an escape route, or a meeting point for someone who had no intention of being seen. Rain arrived just after noon, thin, needling, and constant, turning the garden paths slick and the air colder than it should have been. Margaret didn't let it slow her. If anything, the shift in weather sharpened her focus. Whoever had moved through Briarcrest's forgotten garden had worked quickly, methodically, and now the elements were washing away the evidence. The constable returned with a canvas satchel, muttering about how the station wasn't equipped for botanical crimes. But he followed Margaret without argument. Briggs trailed behind them with a lantern, its glow unsteady in the damp breeze. They pushed through the narrow passage in the hedge. The air changed instantly, colder, shaded, muffled. On the other side lay a small clearing between the garden wall and a row of pines. The ground was churned, the soil soft with footprints. 2 sets, Briggs noted. Same heavy boots as before and smaller ones. Eleanor's. Margaret crouched, tracing one print with her fingers. The heel was deeper than the toe. She was stepping back, not forward. The constable frowned, meaning she wasn't approaching this spot. She was being forced toward it. Margaret didn't respond. She'd already seen enough to agree. A few feet away, half buried under pine needles, something metallic glinted. Briggs retrieved it, a flashlight dented on one side, the switch still sticky with dirt. "That's not hers," he said. "Too industrial." Margaret clicked it on. It flickered weakly, then died. But even the brief flash revealed something troubling. Soil streaks across the casing, not from the garden but from somewhere darker, heavier, like a damp basement or deep earth. The constable exhaled, troubled. If Harrow was using this, he brought more than a trowel with him. They followed the trail deeper into the clearing until it ended abruptly at the wall, solid stone stretching 8 feet up. Briggs ran his hands over the ivy. Someone pulled this aside recently. Under the vines, a rectangular outline was cut into the stone. Not a doorway, but a storage recess sealed decades ago with mortar. At its base, fresh chips of stone littered the ground. Harrow was looking for something hidden, Margaret murmured. He wasn't only after rare plants. The constable tapped the recess. The sound was hollow. "Help me clear it." Briggs tore away more ivy until a thin crack became visible along the mortar's edge. The constable worked a chisel into it and pried. The stone slab shifted with a groan. Inside was a shallow compartment no larger than a writing desk drawer. Dust, cobwebs, and a single object wrapped in flaking fabric. Margaret lifted it gently. The cloth disintegrated under her touch, revealing a dark wooden box with brass corners tarnished nearly black. "What is it?" Briggs asked, but Margaret was staring at the brass plate on the lid. Lillian's late husband, Arthur Ashford. Her pulse quickened. "He sealed this here, decades ago." Inside the box lay a leather notebook, its pages brittle with age and covered in Arthur's handwriting. Sketches of the garden, grafting experiments, notes on crossbreeding, warnings about unstable hybrids, and repeated references to the same luminous foxglove. Beside it lay a small glass vial, its cork blackened. Only a trace of powder clung to its bottom, a pale gold dust that shimmered faintly even in the gray rain. Briggs stepped back. "Is that dangerous?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She knew enough about rare plant variants to recognize when something wasn't meant to be handled casually. Arthur had hidden this, protected it, and Harrow had almost uncovered it. She closed the box. This is why he came. Eleanor's sketches only guided him to what Arthur spent years concealing. The constable straightened. "If Harrow finds out we got here first, he'll come back," Margaret finished. He's not done. And he's not running. A gust of wind rattled the pines, and she felt it clearly now. The garden wasn't quiet. It was waiting. The storm broke just after dusk, lightning flickering across the hills behind Briarcrest. Margaret stood at the window, the wooden box resting on the desk beside her. The house felt heavier now, as though every forgotten secret Arthur had buried was shifting in the walls. Eleanor was resting upstairs, sedated, though her sleep was uneasy. The garden had left its mark on her. The constable and Briggs patrolled the grounds in widening circles, lantern beams slicing through the rain. They were looking for signs of Harrow, but Margaret suspected they were already too late or exactly on time. Men like him didn't vanish. They circled back. A crack of thunder rattled the panes. The lanterns outside paused. Then Briggs shouted. Margaret grabbed a coat and hurried down the stairs. By the time she reached the rear terrace, the two men stood near the stone gate, their lanterns aimed at the path. Muddy prints, fresh, sharp-edged, cut straight toward the garden. Harrow had returned. Margaret exhaled once, steadying herself. He's after the box. He wouldn't risk coming back for anything else. The constable nodded grimly. Stay here. But Margaret stepped forward. He thinks he understands the garden. He doesn't understand who's waiting in it. They followed the footprints through the gate. Rain hammered the leaves, making every shadow jump, but the trail moved deliberately, past the foxgloves, past the shed, straight toward the hidden recess in the wall. Harrow must have discovered the slab missing. Lantern light trembled over the clearing. Harrow stood at the wall, soaked, frantic, running his hands over the empty recess. When he turned, his expression was a mask of calculation collapsing into desperation. You have it, he said. Give me the box. Your business with this house is finished, the constable answered. Harrow took a single step forward. You don't know what that specimen is, what Ashford created, what it could be worth. Margaret held her ground, her voice steady. Arthur hid it for a reason. He hid it from the wrong people, Harrow snapped. Those plants were the pinnacle of his work. A hybrid that shouldn't exist, a mutation no modern lab can reproduce. And you, his eyes flashed toward Margaret, you would rather bury genius than preserve it. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the wild anger twisting his face. He left notes, Margaret said quietly. He warned that the hybrid was unstable, unpredictable. He sealed it away. You don't understand value, Harrow hissed. But collectors do, he lunged. Briggs intercepted him, and the two crashed into wet earth. The constable moved fast, tackling Harrow long enough to snap metal cuffs around his wrists. Even pinned, Harrow fought like a trapped animal, shouting about stolen discoveries, wasted brilliance, fortunes undone. But the storm swallowed his voice. Minutes later, he was dragged toward the house, defeated and silent at last. Margaret returned to the terrace alone. The garden finally looked still, its shadows deep, its secrets quieter. The golden foxglove swayed in the wind like a lone lantern. She knew they would have to seal off the old sections of Briarcrest again, perhaps restore some parts, but the dangerous pieces would stay hidden. Arthur had been right to bury them, and Eleanor, fragile and shaken but alive, would need time to understand just how close she had come to someone who saw her as a key, not a person. Margaret looked toward the windows glowing softly across the rain-soaked lawn. Briarcrest felt lighter now, not free of its past but no longer captive to it. The garden had revealed what it needed to. The rest would stay buried. If you want more cases like this on Inspector Vale, make sure to subscribe and drop a like. It really helps the channel. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you saw those footprints leading back into the garden?